So, neuro-inspired, I was picking up on Conrad's comment a bit earlier. And sometimes listening to some of the talks, I'm not sure I ought to be in this meeting because I would say weakly. I mean, I would love to understand the brain. I'd love to understand, I'd like to understand the brain more than I'd like to build really good artificial intelligence systems. But I feel for myself, I contribute more to that goal by trying to build systems that work and do real tasks in really different situations than I do by studying the details of the neuroscience. Partly, again, to pick up on what Conrad said, is that probably at the moment there may be too little data, although with two-photon methods and things like that, there may be a lot more of it, possibly even too much in the near future. So, I'm certainly interested in really having vision systems that have the same type of abilities as humans, or better, so passing things like visual Turing tests and working well on practical real-world images. So certainly getting inspiration from known properties of the brain and then trying to explain aspects of them, but certainly not really as inspired by the neuroscience as some of the talks we've heard earlier. So this is sort of my goal when I'm feeling really energetic, which, as I say, I'm not at the moment. Ambitious to say, look, could one work out what the properties of the visual system are from first principles? What is it solving? It's solving the task of getting an awful lot of information in and processing it extremely quickly and doing all sorts of things like that. That is an information processing task. So surely at some level one could almost deduce that from reality. Now, knowing various people in the audience will pick me up if I make too strong a point about that, there are certainly a whole lot of biological, evolutionary constraints which would stop that from being really, really practical, but still, I still like to think in that way. So human visual abilities, one of the aspects of these is, and this is bringing in the idea of complexity, is that the human visual system has many more abilities than current computer vision systems. You're hearing now that, say, deep networks are doing better than humans on certain tasks. Well, that's really only true if you give the deep networks a bit of a helping hand, such as allowing them to put their best 5 outputs or something, or possibly constraining the data set. I mean, if I want to get a computer vision algorithm to outperform a human visual system, I can do it very easily by picking the data set very carefully. And in my experience, it's usually a sign that the data set and the tasks being done are somewhat too simple and too restricted. Okay, so abilities the human visual system has include robustness, flexibility, unsupervised learning, small numbers of examples, one-shot learning. But really, I think, it's this enormous scope of visual tasks you can do, not just saying that that's a fox, but saying what the fox is doing, where the fox is, what time of the year it is, things like that. Not just finding a box around the cat, but saying where is the head, where is the body, where are the legs, and all those types of properties. So I'd argue if there was a fundamental problem of vision or even of intelligence, it's complexity. So I mean, that could be complexity in the complexity of the neural system, which, as one hears from talks by Sebastian and so on, is incredibly complex. But also the complexity of images, scenes, and visual tasks. And so the experiments done by Simon Thorpe and others showing that considering the enormous visual space of images and output space of objects, how on earth can we get even a coarse interpretation of an image within about 150 milliseconds, and how, if we're given a little bit more time, we can address so many more visual tasks, reasoned about objects, relationships, and many other things. So for myself, I have a research program, and the part that I'm mainly going to talk about today, given the shortage of time, is the sort of the theoretical framework and trying to think of conceptual architecture which are able to perform these tasks. The second one, which is sort of where I really do most of my work, which is where I am developing working computer vision systems, and I have to persuade people in the computer science community that I'm doing 2% or 5% or 7% better than anybody else on a particular state-of-the-art data set, at least I'm doing that for for a few weeks while the paper's being reviewed, and then a few weeks later somebody's doing a lot better than me also. So there's a question of really scaling up from toy world to real world, because with some of the models that I'll talk about today, I'm quite proud of them. I think they do very nice things, but I have to admit they do nice things because we've restricted the data sets that they work on. And so the challenge for me is to take things which have some of the nice properties that I have in here and enabling to work as one works on more complex and realistic data. Scaling framework from behavioral electrophysiology imaging and so on. How much do we really know about how the brain does processing? And so I collaborate with people like Tyson Lee, who of course gave a very nice talk earlier, Dan Kirsten and so on. Hardware, I guess people here are interested in hardware, and in the last year we started on an NSF expedition, PI, Vijay Naranjan, and so one of the aspects for me there is to take some of the visual algorithms and try and put them onto hardware. This talk, concentrating on the theoretical framework, basic principles, build models recursively from reusable components. I'm a little bit embarrassed about the talk because I was checking it through and I found I haven't got a single equation in it. And for myself, I have to say I'm far more at ease giving talks where there are large numbers of equations, because they're mathematics. I know mathematics, I like mathematics, I understand mathematics, and here I have to take the mathematical things, translate them into words, and try and get the main message across, and I'm not sure I do as good a job as that as other people do. So anyway, I'll concentrate on that without any math. I'll have some sort of examples about how you can do similar things like this or better ones on more challenging data sets. There'll be a bit of speculations about neuroscience and so on. And I also say, since I'm talking about compositional models, in a way I'm representing a strand of people, Stuart Cheeman, Song Chong Zhu, David Mumford, Tyson Lee, and others. So I think part of the reason for this slide was I was talking with a friend of mine about a grant proposal, and the grant, in the call for the proposal, it was supposed to do some things like unsupervised learning in presence of clutter, learning without supervision. And as I was talking to my friend, I thought, wait a moment, we've actually done that. At least we've done that up to a limited extent that you'll see here. And we didn't directly do learning from numbers of examples here because, to be frank, at the time we did this a few years ago, that wasn't a hot topic. And if we were doing it now, we'd have done a few more experiments to show that you could have done the same thing with the same type of model. So the idea here is to simplify things by having what's called interest points. So interest points, here are a few of them on the head of, I think, an unknown Caltech student, or probably well known to many people, possibly tenured faculty somewhere by now. And so it's basically somewhere in the image where something is interesting is going on. In the background area here, roughly flat, not interesting. Edges, not interesting either. Corners, a bit more interesting because there's sort of quite a lot of local structure there. They're localizable. So you get an interest point detector. There's whole lots of literature about how you could get one of those. So it doesn't really matter for this purpose. The interest point would be described by position X, orientation of it, and then some attributed feature. And again, attributed feature descriptions, that's sort of in the black arts in vision about what features you ought to have. And I'm one of the many people who hope that deep networks will get rid of all the reams of papers written about features by just saying we use deep network features for what we do, and that makes our life simpler, and you don't have to teach large amounts of sort of somewhat ad hoc studies about what a feature should be. Anyway, the point here, interest points, simplifies your image, so it's only got, say, 100 or 200 interest points. Attributed features, you cluster on the attributed features to get a dictionary, so everything is described by an interest point, its orientation, and one of these attributed features. Then you go towards the compositional thing of sort of grouping together attributed features that happen frequently with certain spatial relationships between them. So here is a triple, a point here, this is an attributed feature pointing in that direction, here's one pointing in this direction, and the colors are supposed to encode that this is attributed feature type 1, type 2, type 3, up to type 100, 200, or 300, or whatever it is. And here are a few of the attributed features working on a couple of images. So, as I said, I'm leaving out tons of mathematics just to get the main points across. And for some reason, this is not responding. Escape. Escape. Wonderful. Thank you. And here, given that structure, given you can make those simplification assumptions, you can do a lot of nice things in the sense of unsupervised learning without any, in presence of background and a sort of cocktail party problem. So you start with a default background model, all your interest points in the image are sort of random, independent, etc. Then you search for triplets of IPs that occur frequently. You build a model. Your model initially is everything is a set of background things. Next, your model is things are background, or they can be instances of this particular IP triplet. Then you carry on with this procedure. You can grow your model so it can consist of several IP triplets stuck together, or it could have an OR node, and it could have a different IP triplet for a different type of object. So if you proceed with this idea, and you can interpret this in terms of MDL or better encoding of images, that given the set of data, you can find 1, 2, 3, or an arbitrary number of objects in it, provided they can be described by this type of model. So results, you can do unsupervised learning of object classes in noisy background, cocktail party problem. You can throw in images where there's almost, say half of the images have just got background stuff, no structure in it. Other half of the images, they do have some particular object structure in there somewhere, and the system is capable of doing that. You could learn mixtures of object classes without knowing how many exist. So here, as an example, you throw stuff in. There were some airplanes, there were some people, there was some bikes, and yet you automatically learn this model, and this model. You can learn allowing for spatial transformations, and I say a small number of examples we didn't really do. The basic thing here is you're building things up from compositions, and so once you've got a certain composition of a part altogether, you can sort of grow on it, you can make something bigger. So the basic processes are fairly simple. They're clustering, and then basically more clustering, and building models which have these structure representations built into them. So these were mentioned in earlier talks. I think Gary Marcus, I'm not sure he likes this type of structure, but it relates to the sort of structure he was putting in, and I would agree those sorts of relationships are important, and I'd even push them to occur very low down in low-level vision. Here is just a quick example to show you can do things. That was interest points. You can do them in slightly more structured things. You can do things on cars from different viewpoints, giraffes, and so on. So basic elements, dictionary elements of things grouped into compositions with spatial relations and so on being represented explicitly. Learning can be unsupervised. You can learn mixture models in that way. Models and neurons, to what extent can they do this? They differ from things like classical perceptrons or artificial neural network models. But on the other hand, from my perspective, as a sort of somebody who's interested in neuroscience but wouldn't call myself a neuroscientist, there's a whole lot of ideas out there, binding problems, and it's interesting to hear various people we're talking about today. Von der Marsberg has talked about this for ages, Abeles, shifter circuits, and so on. So it seems that if you had these types of models, it wouldn't be too hard to put them in real neurons. And I was encouraged by sort of talking to my friend Bartolomeo at USC, who loves modeling real neurons, and whenever I ask him, you get me a set of neurons to do things like this, he more or less says, yes, easy, no problem. So, there's a question of individual neurons being, having potentially far more complex abilities than the sort of standard perceptron type model. Closest neural network model, I think there's a very interesting book by Les Valiant published some time ago that discusses how you can do things like clustering, memorizing, and binding. I don't know if he talked about concatenation or other things that Gary was asking for, but it was certainly moving towards that level of wanting to have something that was in sort of neural type components, so sort of perceptron-like, but with a few extra things, so that it was programmable. Essentially a programmable neural network model based out of elementary components, but by having all the types of nice things that a computer scientist would like to have. Also, I think another thing that he had here, which I liked also, was that he sort of really was addressing the complexity issue. You know, how many memories could you store in a cortex if you use these types of models? And for me, I think complexity is a major thing. So moving on here, moving into trying to address complexity, was to go into hierarchies and build recursive dictionaries of triplets of triplets of triplets. There's nothing special here about triplets, it's just that's what the student Leo Zhu, who did a lot of this work, chose to use. I should say that Leo is an extremely brilliant student, and possibly that's one testament to that is he's no longer in academia, he's running a startup company, and that seems to be where my most talented students seem to go these days. Anyway, you build a hierarchies of dictionaries, so like a T is built out of a horizontal and vertical bar plus a certain spatial relationship, and L, a horizontal and vertical bar plus a different set of spatial relationships, and then you keep going. It's important that the T would be deformable, the lower level features, the horizontal vertical bars, they could just sort of be rigid. Above that, the T would be compositions allowing certain spatial relations to happen, and then you just keep on going. Compositionality, and so everything is built out of combining elementary models by composition. This was a plug that I got from somewhere about the values of compositionality, the ability to answer many different questions based on the same underlying knowledge structure. So, for example, you could detect an object, you could detect the cat, but you could also say whether the legs of the cat and the ears of the cat are from the same representation. That would not be another, you wouldn't detect the cat and then have to find them. Find the parts of the cat, they'd all be done sort of simultaneously. No need to learn the task structure. There's also be the ability to learn if you have sets of part models and you see something new that you've never seen before, but it's made up of a composition of parts you already have, then you can learn it far more easily. You just have to take those parts and stick them together, and that saves a lot of time. Advantage of hierarchies, issues, part sharing, efficiency of representation, inference, and learning. So here is, two models of two objects. Capital A is made out of A and little b, etc. Capital B made out of B and C. B is shared between here. So instead of having two models, you have a single model where this part here, the B part, can be there and can be put up into capital B as well. So this is one aspect. This, of course, is a really toy thing. You want to do this, or we've done this. The biggest case, we've done this where there were 100 types of objects at the top, and I forget how many parts in between. So part sharing gives you efficiency of representation, inference, and also learning. This other thing of executive level summary is that the part descriptions are less detailed than the subparts. So the top level thing, the boss knows there's an elephant in the room. The lower level executive knows where the foot is. Maybe the janitor has a foot standing on his toe, but at least the level of knowledge is structured in a way that it is in a good corporation. The head of Amazon, apparently he doesn't want to read a 600-page report about what's going on in a subpart of Amazon. He wants a 6-page report. He wants people under him who probably have 6-page reports going down, and so by distributing the knowledge, you can, I think, gain you can gain an enormous amount in representation. So it means that the objects are really represented in a hierarchical distributed manner. The top level would represent the crude position, and the next level part would represent the more detailed position of the part, and going down to the bottom, the edges would be represented right at the bottom level. Here is an example from Leo Zhu's work. This is where you start with these little objects, models, little tiny representations, and then you just learn hierarchies, one after the other just by clustering, looking for suspicious coincidences of combinations of structures. You move up from here, you get these, and finally you get the objects. So the objects are then, by construction, they're built out of parts which are shared between things, and so when you're doing inference on these, if you find the part, you can use it for many different types of objects. You don't need to use it just for the same one. The inference architecture, you have forms of bottom-up and top-down parsing. I mean, a little bit similar to the previous talk, probably different in details, but certainly I believe in that. The bottom-up parse is you look at local areas of the image, you look for low-level structures. Those are ambiguous, so you can make several hypotheses for them. You don't know which is correct. You pass them up to the next level. You're now looking for more complex structure. These are less ambiguous, so you're more sure of it. By the time you pass it right up to the top, it's probably pretty unambiguous, and you know that it's a cat or a dog or something. And then what's left for you to do is to clean up a lot of the lower level stuff, a lot of the lower level hypotheses that you that are incorrect and are not consistent with anything higher up. Complexity analysis. This was work that I was doing with student Matagi. So first, all the models we had were sort of basically serial formulated graphical model type stuff where things could take various states. To turn them into a neural model, essentially you just take a part and you just have multiple copies of it. So in a sense, you could have a sort of a convolutional compositional model. It's very much the same idea as done in convolutional networks. And then what you try and do is you do analysis of the inference complexity if it's a serial formulation, or the memory complexity in the parallel formulation. And the bottom line is that, not surprisingly, you get enormous gains by this type of architecture. I mean, this is not, obviously, this is still a toy type architecture. It's not a complete toy. You can get models of this sort to do something reasonable on difficult computer vision problems, and so you could publish papers on that type of data set a few years ago, but on the other hand, it's not working at the level of ImageNet. Nevertheless, I think as a metaphor, it works reasonably well, and this issue of showing how you can, as a sort of a toy conceptual model of the cortex, I think it gives you an idea of how you can, by sharing parts, by having this executive level representation, you can obtain these types of sort of mathematical gains. And if anyone in the audience knows any other work of this type, I'd be interested in it. There have been studies before of complexity, but this is my attempt to do a sort of less valiant model of the study of the complexity of the, of the visual cortex. How am I doing for time? 5 minutes. Okay, that's good. I put this slide up because Tai-Sing Lee was mentioning about whether inference should be done horizontally or vertically, and so just a slight plug for work we did on motion estimation. We also formulated that in a compositional way, and so in here, instead of doing motion estimation in a horizontal manner, you could do it by propagating up to a higher level and then propagating down again. The last talk mentioned the work of Van der Heit and Snebo about things like this, and I was discussing this a little with them just a few weeks ago. In this case, we didn't do any connection to neuroscience. We did do some connection to psychophysics. Applications, and so, if I just give a talk at the level that I've given it so far, I feel a little bit of a fraud because, okay, I think the ideas are there. There's some mathematics, even though I didn't describe it. But in my community, I really need to show that models of this type in general can do really well on real worlds, on increasingly challenging data sets. So as an issue, you have to scale up from things that work on simple data sets. So like these days, Caltech 101 is a really simple data set. And the early models will work perfectly on that, but that's not really where things are at. now. You'd have to get things to work on ImageNet or Pascal or something of that challenge. If the brain, if vision was only done in a world where there were random dots and vertical bars, then it would have been solved easily 20 years ago. The real difficulty of doing vision, from my perspective, is the complexity of the real world, and it's only in the last few years that by having bigger and bigger data sets that we've been able even to start grappling with that level of complexity. So here are just a few things which I have to admit caveats. We're using various hybrid things. We're even using DCNNs as, say, feature detectors to find parts of objects. And then we use the compositional things to stick them together so that we can parse the object and describe it. And so we can get three-dimensional estimations out from single objects and so on. And even do some text to captioning and a few other things like that. Okay. Yeah, I think I can manage the last slide. Okay, so theoretical issues. I think at the top level, if I said what was the problem of vision or even the brain in general, I'd say it would have to be complexity and how on earth to deal with the complexity of it. Range of tasks, challenges, complexity of images, and so on. For me, I'm very attracted to the idea of the compositionality approach, the idea of sort of visual grammars where you take parts, you can represent them more explicitly than you would do in a deep network. You can build things between them. You can have structures, reasons about them. You can sort of do things like causal inference. You can sort of try and estimate the causes of things that happened. So it seems to me that theoretically there's very nice things to be said for that. And I hope I've given you a few examples to persuade you that at least that they're interesting. Okay. Otherwise, I think you can get certain of these things to work on natural images and data sets, and the challenge for people like me who believe in compositional models is really to show that they are really working on really complicated scenes and systems and not just on Caltech or some of the other data sets of that type. Relations to neuroscience, I'm really quite interested in these models. I didn't, how they could relate. I wasn't initially thinking of them as models for neuroscience, but the more I look at the current literature, I see, okay, they're not neuroscientifically motivated, but they seem to be consistent with quite a lot of things that you find about neuroscience, particularly if you bring in these issues of binding and so on, and things of that sort. Final thing is relations to hardware. This is perhaps maybe, I believe there's quite a lot of hardware people in the audience, and I think that I think with computer vision, one of the successes of it over the last few years, and that a lot of that's credit due to the deep convolutional networks, is the ability to process things in parallel, to throw GPUs at series of problems. And GPUs are fine, they're nice, but they only do a limited number of things, and I think there's great scope for developing other hardware systems that can implement particular types of algorithms that have shown to be successful. And so that's where I'm collaborating with these people on this called chips in silicon. Otherwise, here are a bunch of references of things. The sort of the big picture thing here, the compositional complexity thing, there was in 2013 and should appear in a Machine Journal article this year. Okay, thank you.
Hi, so I have a question about, excuse me, one of the last things you talked about, I think, with the hierarchical mechanism that you, essentially you mentioned the fact that you talked to Ernst, Niebuhr, and Van der Heijden about grouping, about motor cells and grouping, and ultimately computing motion at that level. Yeah. I'm kind of interested about that. So how did you think about it? I mean, so, I've always thought that motion was computed much lower, and now...
Sorry, it's still not at a really high level. I'm still not really saying you necessarily go up into IT or somewhere like that. Okay. It's just that, yeah, you have bigger receptive fields which can have a bigger bigger access or something. I think Tai Sing was also thinking about that. The computations, were they being done in V1 or were they being done in V2? Were they done in V1 by parallel things, or were they being done in V1 and thrown up into V2 and then parked out into V1?
But in your model, the way that you computed motion at the higher points of the hierarchy, what were you computing motion on? I guess that's what I'm trying to get to.
Oh, compositions of motion patterns. So the idea that the low-level part of the image, just a small part of the image, you'd have a little tiny motion pattern that you try and estimate that wasn't very accurate because it's very local and locally vision is ambiguous, and then you'd sort of compose those into bigger, sort of larger patterns over larger parts of the image. That would be more unambiguous, but it would also be a little bit more abstract, so then you'd have to feed that down to give context to the low-level thing. Yeah, sorry, context was the word I was grouping for earlier, because Tai Sing was using that as sort of implementing context sideways or implementing bottom-up and top-down. And so this was, the context was being done top-down.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So it will come as no surprise that I'm very sympathetic to what you talked about, but I will nonetheless ask a devil's advocate question.
Okay.
Which is, the conventional wisdom in psychology is that the Biedermann-Geon models and things like that didn't really work out. The people store multiple views and they're not breaking things into geons, or like in the classic MAR, breaking things into axes and so forth. So what do you think is the best rejoinder to that? I mean,
yeah, I'm not really sure of that. I mean, all I know is Irv certainly likes the type of things I talk about.
I don't doubt that he does. I mean,
Yeah.
Look, I mean, it could be that what you're proposing is a reasonable model for AI and not for psychology, or it could be that we're missing something in psychology. My own answer would be, well, obviously we can do these tasks. So I can look up there and I can say, well, those chairs, they form a set. There's some kind of coherence to them. But there is this kind of wave in psychology of saying it's all stored views.
Well, I'm not sure of that. I know, because I used to talk to Bob Hummel, because he was one of Irv's students, of course. And I don't know, when I was looking, I mean, there was a whole lot of debate, I think, in the late 1990s between Irv and various other people. And, from the outside, you look at the data, you look at the type of experiments being done, and they were being done on really quite different types of things, I think. So, people were doing things on paper clips on one side, and greebles and things by Mike Tarr, and on the other hand, Irv was more talking about object models for which you had, you've had quite a lot of experience, you've stored them and so on.
The thing that strikes me is you had that image of 4 different tasks or something like that at the bottom of one of your slides, and almost all the work right now is on the ImageNet thing of identifying the fox, as the only thing in the frame. And of course we do a lot of visual cognition other than that. Most of these tasks aren't really getting at that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I would say I want to do all of them, and we are, at least in the computer vision community we are attempting all of them, clearly because humans can do it, and so on. So I tend to be a bit more on Irv's side than on the other people's side on that. I think it can relate to the, I think, yeah. The thing is, okay, we're more like representing, recognizing ships and things like that, or whatever Irv was showing than doing things like paper clips.
Yeah, Alan, very nice. I agree it's very important for these systems to know the relationships between parts of objects. I just got a question which you may or may not care to answer, but the word hierarchy has been used a lot of times today. So maybe at a high level, can you contrast your notion of hierarchy with other people's? Just maybe that also starts up discussion.
Between that and the deep networks, I mean, clearly the types of hierarchies I have, or the ones I want, possibly, to be a bit more modest, would be far more structured and have all these types of representations between them, because I think ultimately that's what you need to have. As I say, I'm very impressed with the deep networks, and in some of the more practical things, we use a deep network, say, to find elbows. Well, that's reasonable. Okay, finding elbows, you could say, is something that you need a really clever template matching system for which deep networks are doing well. But to reason about whether you can find the elbow and putting things together, the different parts together, particularly in the cases where you have occlusion and occlusion can be anywhere. I think you need to have the spatial relations, or else if you're treating it more as a classification problem, which deep networks would do, you end up by having far too many things to classify. There's a paper that I ought to write if I have the time and the energy somewhere about pushing the composition, or putting that arguments about the range of exponential numbers of tasks that I think you need to have to solve. But anyway, that's a short answer, and it's not just my voice that's going. I think my mind isn't as alert as it usually is. Okay.
I'll try to ask an easy question then.
Thank you.
You mentioned a few times in your talk, which was excellent, about the challenge of scaling up these models, or this approach to real data. And obviously you've done a lot of that in your work and in your papers, but can you talk a little bit about what the kinds of challenges are in scaling up these compositional approaches to what you say sort of the state-of-the-art data sets are? Are they primarily challenges in implementation, where it's just boring to write bigger models that work on bigger systems, or are they conceptual challenges in managing the complexity of the explosion of alternatives?
I think one problem is simply knowing what on earth goes on in images, for which we need even more images to get hold of. I think one of the issues is probably the issue of the hardware and so on. So to make a provocative comment, I think neural networks or certain deep networks are effective because they're things that you can implement very easily, and you can train on deep networks. I would like to think the compositional models, require far more training to do, particularly if you want to get them to work at that level of performance. If you're starting from scratch, at least to start out with, might require different types of hardware systems. I think at the moment my pragmatic strategy is I'll say, okay, I'll use the deep networks for the low-level things like finding elbows, which are harder to do, and then I'll just put the spatial relations and everything else on top of those, and the 3D geometry. And I think that's a very doable type of thing. I personally like to replace the deep networks at the lower level, but I'll leave that to Stuart Geeman, who I'm hoping to write a grant proposal with, because he feels, I'm not sure, I don't want to say he feels confident of that, but he has various ideas at that level. Why bother? Well, there's still an issue about the scaling. I'm not really sure. I think, because scaling is, well, I'll leave, maybe given my current state of mind, I'll leave you to discuss that with Stu. But it's certainly a question. Possibly deep networks has solved the low-level things well enough that we don't have to bother with them. And certainly, for me, pragmatically, the gain, at least in computer vision, is just sort of using them as components and then gluing things together. But there are arguments, and Stuart could make some of them, that even so, you may want to replace the lower level things by something that's more structured and more understandable. And that if we figure it out better, could be maybe learned quite easily. But, yeah.
Thank you. Looking at your trees of triangles and so forth made me think of something. Some people have done some work in applying simplicial homology to characterization of visual spaces based upon simultaneity of activation, of groups of place cell neurons without having any knowledge directly of activations in the visual cortex, but just looking at place cell neurons in the hippocampus. They've been able to characterize visual spaces as to whether they were two-dimensional or one-dimensional, and whether there were holes in them and so on, and thereby possibly build object representations. They've moved on to applying ring homology now and using those algebras. I just wondered if you'd thought of any similar thing or were using such techniques or what.
No, I'd be interested if you give me a reference or two to that.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, we were using, well, we were doing something else on simplices and simplices complexes, but it's, I think, a rather different thing than what you're talking about. But
Okay,
maybe send me a reference or something, I can look at it. I'd be
thank you.
curious. Okay, thank you.